She had the kind of smile that made people forget how quiet the room had been before she walked in. To her neighbors in Friendswood, Texas, Clara Harris was the very image of composure, a dentist, a mother of twins, a woman who'd built a life with care and precision. Her husband, David Harris, was her equal in almost every way. Charming, successful, the co-owner of the same dental practice. Together, they were the portrait of upper-middle-class calm. That image would not survive the summer of 2002. It began, as it often does, with whispers. Clara had noticed the late nights, the vague explanations, the faint smell of perfume that didn't belong to her. She hired a private investigator, hoping the truth would be kind. It wasn't. The investigator confirmed what she feared. David was having an affair with his receptionist, a young woman named Gail Bridges. Clara's anger, once a simmering ache, hardened into something sharp. On July 24, 2002, Clara arranged to meet her husband at the Nassau Bay Hilton. She told him she wanted to talk, to reconcile, to fix what had been broken. But the meeting wasn't what she expected. As she arrived at the hotel parking lot, she saw David with Gail. The investigator she'd hired followed discreetly, his camera ready. He would capture every moment that followed. Witnesses described the scene as a blur of headlights and screaming. Clara, in her silver Mercedes-Benz, accelerated toward her husband. Once, twice, then a third time. David was thrown to the ground and the car rolled over him. When the police arrived, they found Clara sitting in the driver's seat, her hands trembling on the wheel, her sons in the back seat. At trial, her defense team argued that it had been an act of passion, an uncontrollable surge of emotion brought on by betrayal. The prosecution saw it differently. They showed the jury the surveillance footage, the sound of tires screeching, the unmistakable intent in each turn of the steering wheel. Clara Harris was found guilty of murder in 2003 and sentenced to 20 years in prison. In prison, Clara kept mostly to herself. Former inmates described her as polite, reserved, still haunted by the images of that night. She served 15 years before being paroled in 2018. When she walked out of prison, she was 58 years old, a woman who had once had everything and had watched it all unravel in a single furious moment. Her sons, who had seen it all from the back seat, grew up without their father and without their mother for most of their lives. One of them would later say that he forgave her, not because it was easy, but because he couldn't live any other way. And so, the story of Clara Harris lingers in the quiet space between love and rage, a reminder that sometimes the heart's need for justice can become its own kind of crime. She was known for her laughter, the kind that made even the dullest dinner parties come alive. In her small town of Bellefontaine, Ohio, Sheila Davalloo seemed to have it all: intelligence, beauty, and a promising career as a researcher at Purdue Pharma. To her colleagues, she was focused and meticulous. To her friends, she was a mystery, a woman who never revealed too much. To her husband, Paul Christos, she was loving, attentive, and devoted. But underneath the ordinary rhythm of her life, something else was quietly growing. It began in 2001 when Sheila developed feelings for a coworker named Nelson Sessler. He was kind, soft-spoken, and already in a relationship with another woman, Annalisa Raimundo. Sheila, unable to let go, began weaving herself deeper into their lives. She would invite Nelson and Annalisa to dinner, pretending to be a supportive friend, while jealousy burned behind every smile. When Nelson's relationship with Annalisa became more serious, Sheila's resentment turned cold and deliberate. On November 8, 2002, police received a frantic 911 call from a woman's apartment in Stamford, Connecticut. The call was short, filled with gasps and muffled screams. When officers arrived, they found 32-year-old Annalisa Raimundo lying in the doorway, brutally beaten and stabbed to death. There were no signs of forced entry. Investigators were initially baffled. Annalisa's boyfriend, Nelson, had a solid alibi. He was at work. The case went cold for nearly a year, until a strange and violent incident in another city reopened the trail. In March 2003, in Pleasantville, New York, police were called to the home of Sheila Davalloo. Her husband, Paul, had been stabbed repeatedly in the chest. Sheila had called 911 herself, claiming it was an accident during a game they often played, one where she blindfolded him and guessed objects by touch. This time, she said, the knife slipped. Paul survived, and while recovering in the hospital, he told detectives about the unusual circumstances. Something about the calmness in Sheila's voice as she described the attack made investigators suspicious. Detectives began looking into her background, and what they found pulled everything together. Cell records showed Sheila near Annalisa's apartment the day of the murder. Hair and DNA evidence matched. When questioned, she denied everything, but the circumstantial web around her was unbreakable. In 2004, Sheila was convicted of attempted murder for stabbing her husband and sentenced to 25 years. In 2012, after years of appeals and investigation, she was finally convicted of the 2002 murder of Annalisa Raimundo and sentenced to 50 years in Connecticut, to be served consecutively. In interviews, prosecutors described her as brilliant but chillingly detached, a woman who could plan, manipulate, and destroy lives with clinical precision. She had spent years crafting a love triangle only she understood, one that ended with 2 lives shattered and 1 locked away forever. Behind bars, Sheila remains analytical, even proud of her intellect. She's earned degrees, written essays, and continues to deny involvement in the murder. Those who've met her say she can still disarm people with charm, but that there's a coldness in her eyes, a void where empathy should live. Annalisa's family never fully recovered. They described her as kind, compassionate, with a love for life that drew people in. Her father once said that the hardest part wasn't the loss itself, it was knowing how deliberate it had been. That someone had wanted her gone not out of rage or accident, but calculation. The story of Sheila Davalloo stands as a chilling portrait of obsession. A woman whose love became control, whose intelligence became weaponry, and whose heart, once human, turned methodical, leaving nothing behind but silence and a locked cell door. On a quiet morning in 2011 in the small town of Elmhurst, Illinois, the neighbors heard nothing unusual from the Vaughn family's silver SUV parked along an isolated frontage road. Inside the vehicle sat a man named Christopher Vaughn, covered in blood but somehow alive. In the back seat, his 3 children, Abigail, Cassandra, and Blake, were motionless. In the front passenger seat, his wife Kimberly slumped against the window, a gun resting near her lap. When the police arrived, Christopher claimed that Kimberly had snapped, that she'd shot their children before turning the gun on herself, and that he'd barely escaped. He said she'd been depressed, overwhelmed, and unpredictable. But as detectives examined the scene, the details refused to make sense. The trajectory of the gunshots, the lack of gunpowder residue on Kimberly's hands, and the placement of the weapon all suggested a different story, one that pointed straight back at the only surviving family member. The tragedy of the Vaughn family would become one of Illinois' most haunting domestic crime cases, but it began, as so many do, with subtle cracks in a perfect-looking marriage. Kimberly had been a devoted mother, balancing homeschooling, field trips, and family outings. Christopher, quiet and methodical, worked in computer security. Friends said the couple seemed fine, but investigators would later uncover a growing distance. Christopher had begun frequenting online chat rooms under false names, posting about wanting to start over and live off the grid. He'd also visited strip clubs, spending thousands of dollars on private dances and long conversations with women who barely knew him. On June 14, 2007, Christopher told Kimberly they were going on a surprise family trip to a water park. Instead, the drive ended on a lonely stretch of I-55. What happened next would take years to piece together. Forensic evidence showed that the gun used belonged to Christopher. Gunshot residue was found on his hands, not Kimberly's. The angle of the shots and the sequence suggested deliberate execution, not a chaotic murder-suicide. Prosecutors argued that Christopher Vaughn had planned the murders to free himself from the responsibilities of family life. He'd been researching survivalist websites and had withdrawn large sums of money in the weeks leading up to the shootings. The jury listened to the evidence in stunned silence as prosecutors described how he shot his wife first, then turned on his sleeping children one by one. In 2012, Christopher Vaughn was found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder. But one person wasn't in that courtroom, Kimberly. She'd been painted as both the victim and, in the early moments of the investigation, the alleged perpetrator. Her reputation was shredded before the truth had time to surface. It was her family who restored it, fighting to clear her name in public memory. For years, people debated whether Vaughn's emotionless demeanor meant guilt or shock. But the facts were unshakable. His gun, his motive, his lies. Behind his calm face was a man who wanted freedom more than family, a man who believed he could walk away from the wreckage and start a new life. He's currently serving 4 life sentences at Menard Correctional Center with no possibility of parole. Those who've seen him say he's as cold and distant as he was the day of the murders, rarely speaking to anyone, always calculating, always separate. But the real ghost of that story is Kimberly, a woman whose final moments were spent trying to hold her family together, unaware that the man beside her was about to destroy it. Some crimes feel like eruptions of rage. Others are as still as the morning they happen. This one was the latter. A husband who wanted to erase his world. A wife who paid for his silence. In the suburbs of Knoxville, Tennessee, the coffee shops opened early and everyone seemed to know everyone else's story. But no one really knew Mary Winkler. She was quiet, polite, the kind of woman who smiled softly in conversation and kept her struggles buried under a gentle voice. To her church community, she was the image of a devoted wife, married to Matthew Winkler, a respected minister who preached every Sunday with calm authority and a bright, unshakable faith. Their marriage, at least from the outside, looked picture perfect. They lived in a small parsonage behind the 4th Street Church of Christ, with 3 young daughters and the sort of predictable rhythm that small towns often idealize. Matthew was seen as a role model, charismatic, devout, and disciplined. Mary stayed home, caring for the children, preparing sermons with him, and ensuring every public appearance reflected well on their faith. But beneath the image of grace and devotion, something darker was growing, something that would, one March morning in 2006, end in a flash of gunfire. That morning began like any other. The parsonage was quiet, the children asleep, but Mary's mind was restless. She later said she didn't remember making the decision, only that it had been coming for a long time. Years of humiliation, strict control, and emotional strain had built up behind her calm exterior, like pressure behind glass. In the bedroom, while Matthew slept, she reached for a 12-gauge shotgun. The shot echoed through the small house. When her daughters woke, Mary told them something had happened to their father, but her tone, by every account, was oddly calm. She gathered the children, loaded them into the family van, and began driving. For nearly 300 miles, she crossed state lines, from Tennessee into Alabama, with her husband's body lying in the parsonage, and a wave of shock spreading through their church community. When police eventually caught up with her in Orange Beach, Alabama, she didn't resist. The officer who handcuffed her said she looked more tired than frightened, like someone who'd finally stopped running. Back in Tennessee, the investigation began to pull apart the life that everyone thought they knew. Church members were stunned. They couldn't reconcile the image of Mary, shy, devoted, motherly, with the act of shooting her husband in cold blood. But the more investigators learned, the more complicated the story became. During her trial, Mary's defense team painted a picture of deep psychological control, years of emotional and physical abuse that she had quietly endured. She claimed that Matthew had berated her, controlled her finances, humiliated her over trivial mistakes, and demanded obedience even in private moments. He allegedly forced her into sexual acts that left her feeling degraded, but she'd never told anyone. The prosecution argued that none of this excused what she'd done, that she had planned the killing. But the jury wasn't so sure. Prosecutors pointed to her calm behavior after the shooting, how she had fled the state with her children, how she'd initially lied to police. But her attorneys countered with testimony from psychologists who described her as traumatized, submissive, and mentally fractured from years of psychological domination. The jury deliberated for 8 hours before delivering a verdict that divided the community. Mary Winkler was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter, not murder. The judge sentenced her to 210 days in jail, plus probation. It was one of the most controversial verdicts in Tennessee's recent legal history. Some saw it as justice for a battered woman finally snapping under years of oppression. Others saw it as a miscarriage, a wife getting away with killing her husband. After her release, Mary regained custody of her daughters. She found part-time work at a dry cleaner's and lived quietly, avoiding the public eye. Reporters tried for years to get interviews, but she rarely spoke. When she finally did, she described her marriage not as a fairy tale, but as a cage. "I still loved him," she said softly in a 2010 interview. "I just wanted him to stop being so mean. I wanted him to listen." Those who knew Matthew Winkler say he wasn't a monster, but perhaps a man who lived with impossible expectations, both of himself and his family. In the pulpit, he preached about patience and understanding. At home, that patience ran out easily. What makes the Winkler case endure isn't the violence itself, but the moral questions it left behind. How far can a person be pushed before breaking? How much suffering stays hidden behind polite smiles and Sunday clothes? Even now, the parsonage where it happened still stands. The church community has moved on, a new family lives there, and children play in the yard without knowing the story of the house. But some locals say that late at night, when the street is quiet and the church bells ring for evening prayer, you can still feel the silence of that morning, the moment when one woman, exhausted and cornered by her own life, did the unthinkable. It wasn't rage. It wasn't hatred. It was something sadder, the moment when fear turns into fatal resolve. Mary Winkler's story is not one of innocence or malice, but of something in between. The gray place where love and suffering coexist, where people pray for help that never seems to come, and where a single gunshot can echo long after the words "I do" have faded. On a spring afternoon in 2015, the peaceful suburbs of Prairie Village, Kansas, were disturbed by a phone call that would unravel one of the most twisted domestic murder cases in recent American history. The caller was a woman, her voice trembling yet strangely composed. Her name was Dana Chandler. She was reporting the murder of her ex-husband, Mike Sisko, and his fiancée, Karen Harkness. But the call wasn't recent. The crime had taken place over a decade earlier, in 2002, and the story Dana was about to tell would pull detectives back into a mystery they thought had gone cold. Back in 2002, Mike Sisko and Karen Harkness were found dead in Karen's Topeka home, each shot multiple times in their sleep. The scene was disturbingly quiet. No signs of forced entry, no stolen property, no evidence of robbery. Just precision. Someone had stood over their bed and fired 11 rounds. The murders were personal, deliberate, and filled with emotion. At the time, detectives suspected Dana Chandler almost immediately. She was the ex-wife, bitter, jealous, and angry over the custody arrangement involving their children. Mike had moved on with his life, and Dana, according to friends and family, had not. She had been described as obsessive, calling Mike repeatedly, driving by his house and showing up uninvited to family events. Her divorce had left her unmoored. She'd been living in a haze of resentment, telling friends that Mike had ruined everything. But suspicion alone isn't evidence. For years, the case sat untouched. There were no witnesses, no murder weapon, no DNA, no fingerprints, just the faint outline of a woman who couldn't let go. Detective Jim Collins, a Topeka homicide investigator, never forgot the case. In 2010, 8 years later, he decided to reopen it. Advances in forensic science hadn't produced new leads, but a deep re-examination of Dana's behavior did. Old interviews resurfaced, letters and recorded voicemails were analyzed, and a timeline emerged that placed her near the victim's home around the night of the killings. The detectives discovered that Dana had no solid alibi. Her car's mileage didn't match the story she gave about her whereabouts that weekend. Gas station receipts and witness statements placed her near Topeka at suspicious hours. And the anger, the unrelenting obsession, was evident in every message she left behind. In 2011, Dana Chandler was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The trial became a media spectacle, not because of celebrity, but because of the unnerving psychological portrait it painted of domestic obsession. In the courtroom, the prosecution presented Dana as a woman consumed by resentment, unable to accept that her ex-husband had found happiness without her. They described a mind so twisted by control and rejection that the only solution she saw was to erase what she couldn't have. The defense, however, painted her as a victim of assumption, a woman trapped in circumstantial evidence and character attacks, with no physical proof linking her to the murders. During the trial, jurors were shown photos of the crime scene. The images were haunting. 2 lovers asleep, their lives ended in a matter of seconds. It was an act of cruelty carried out with surgical precision. And the question hung in the air: who else could have done it? After deliberating for 6 hours, the jury found Dana Chandler guilty on both counts. She was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 50 years. But the story didn't end there. In 2018, the Kansas Supreme Court overturned her conviction, citing prosecutorial misconduct. The lead prosecutor had made inflammatory statements during closing arguments, appealing to the jury's emotions rather than evidence. Dana was granted a new trial. During her retrial in 2022, the emotional weight of 20 years bore down on everyone in the courtroom. Dana had aged visibly, gray hair, thin frame, eyes that no longer burned with defiance but still carried that sharp, restless intelligence. The prosecution again leaned on circumstantial evidence, her jealousy, her lies, her timeline. The defense argued that the state had built a story around emotion, not proof. The jury was deadlocked. The judge declared a mistrial. Dana was neither free nor convicted, trapped in a legal limbo that reflected the very state of her own mind. Today, she remains behind bars, awaiting the outcome of her next proceedings. She continues to proclaim her innocence. In interviews, she speaks calmly, almost academically, about the justice system, calling herself a wrongfully accused woman. But those who knew her, the ones who saw her anger, her late-night calls, her unpredictable moods, believe something else. Friends of the victim say Dana had a darkness that grew when she lost control of her marriage. A neighbor once recalled hearing her mutter, "If I can't have him, no one will." That phrase became the haunting echo of her case. For the families of Mike and Karen, closure never truly came. Mike's sister once said, "Even if she spends the rest of her life in prison, we still lost two people who should have been here. She took them, and she took our peace." In small towns like Topeka, time doesn't erase tragedy, it preserves it. The house where Mike and Karen died still stands. The same trees outside, the same quiet street. The only difference is that the laughter that once drifted from its windows has been replaced by the memory of gunfire and silence. The story of Dana Chandler is one of obsession masquerading as love, a reminder that some hearts refuse to let go even when they've already lost. It's about what happens when grief becomes control and control becomes destruction. Some people move on after heartbreak. Others turn it into a plan, and in that small Kansas bedroom, 2 lives were taken by someone who, even now, insists she's innocent, even as the evidence whispers otherwise. In the rolling farmland of Pennsylvania, the Shapiro family home looked like any other: white siding, trimmed lawn, the hum of cicadas in summer. To anyone passing by, it was peaceful, the picture of a steady middle-class family. But behind the front door, a slow and silent breakdown was unfolding between a husband and wife who no longer recognized each other. Her name was Ray Carruth, and she'd once been admired in her community for her warmth and energy. Her husband, Robert Shapiro, worked long hours managing a small auto repair business. Together, they'd built a life that from the outside looked steady, even enviable. But beneath it, their marriage was deteriorating. Resentment, distrust, and loneliness had grown quietly in the corners of their home, and by 2006, Ray had become someone unrecognizable to those who had known her best. She began spending long stretches of time online, in chat rooms, message boards, anywhere she could feel seen again. There, she met a man who made her feel alive, someone who told her she deserved more than the routine of her marriage. Soon, those conversations became calls, and those calls became plans. The digital escape that had once been harmless became her entire world, and Robert, once her anchor, became the obstacle between her and freedom. One night, Ray sat awake at the kitchen table long after her husband had gone to bed. The house was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of a clock. She opened her laptop and began searching, not for comfort, but for a way out. How to make it look like an accident. Sleeping pill overdose. Untraceable poisons. It would take investigators months to uncover those searches. By then, Robert would already be dead. It started subtly. Ray began slipping small amounts of antifreeze into Robert's drinks. Just a little at first, enough to make him nauseous, tired, weak. When he complained, she urged him to rest, convincing him he was coming down with the flu. She told neighbors he'd been stressed, overworked, maybe even depressed. The story fit neatly into the image she'd built, the caring wife trying to help a husband under pressure. But as the weeks went on, Robert's condition worsened. He grew disoriented, complained of pain, and struggled to walk. Still, he refused to believe anything was seriously wrong. When he finally agreed to go to the hospital, doctors were baffled. His kidneys were failing, his blood chemistry collapsing. No one suspected foul play, not yet. When Robert died in October 2007, his death certificate listed organ failure due to undetermined causes. Ray played the role of the grieving widow with chilling precision. She organized a tasteful funeral, accepted condolences with trembling hands, and told everyone she couldn't imagine life without him. To most people, her sorrow seemed genuine. But to those who looked a little closer, Something about her grief seemed rehearsed. It might have ended there, a perfect crime, if not for a single conversation overheard by chance. One evening, months after the funeral, Ray confided in a close friend during a dinner party. A few drinks in, her mask slipped. She said something that made the friend's stomach turn. It's strange, isn't it? How easy it is to get away with things when people think you're heartbroken. The friend didn't sleep that night. The next morning, she went to the police. When detectives reopened the case, they began by exhuming Robert's body. Lab results revealed lethal levels of ethylene glycol, the main ingredient in antifreeze. The pattern of his symptoms now made sense. Confusion, weakness, organ shutdown. Each sign pointed to deliberate poisoning. When questioned, Ray denied everything. She claimed she didn't even know what antifreeze was made of. But investigators found receipts for its purchase on her credit card and internet searches that matched the timeline of her husband's illness. The most damning evidence came from her own laptop. Cached pages and deleted history showing an obsession with slow, undetectable poisons. In 2009, Ray was charged with first-degree murder. Her trial drew national attention, with prosecutors describing her as the embodiment of cold calculation, a woman who valued a new romance more than a human life. They presented evidence of her online relationship, her financial troubles, and her desperate need for control. The defense argued that she had been manipulated by the man she met online, that he had encouraged her, planted the idea, and then disappeared when the plan turned deadly. But the jury didn't buy it. The digital trail was too clear. Every step, every search, every purchase. It was all Ray. She was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. When the verdict was read, she showed little emotion. A single tear slid down her cheek, but her face remained still. Reporters noted how she carried herself, not with anger or panic, but with a kind of numb acceptance. In prison interviews, Ray said she still didn't fully understand why she did it. "It was like watching someone else live my life," she told one reporter. "Like I couldn't stop myself from falling." The man she'd met online was never charged. His identity remains largely unknown, hidden behind usernames and untraceable accounts. Some believe he was real. Others think he was just a projection, a fantasy she invented to justify what she'd already decided to do. Robert's sister visits his grave every few weeks. She leaves a small cup of coffee beside his headstone, a quiet ritual they'd shared in life. She once said that the hardest part isn't the loss, but the betrayal. "He trusted her," she said softly. Even when he was dying, he thought she was helping him. He didn't know she was the reason. Ray spends her days in a small cell at Muncie State Correctional Institution. She works in the prison library and rarely speaks about her case. Fellow inmates describe her as polite but distant, as if she's still living somewhere far away, in the version of her life that ended the day she picked up that bottle of antifreeze. Her story isn't one of rage or impulse. It's quieter, slower, a death planned over tea and polite smiles, a murder disguised as devotion. It's the kind of evil that doesn't shout or scream. It whispers. It takes its time. It looks ordinary, and that's what makes it so terrifying. The house still stands on the edge of the neighborhood. New owners live there now. The kitchen where she stirred drinks and wiped the counter clean is bright and renovated. But beneath the floorboards, the ghosts of what happened linger, reminders of how easily love can decay into something deadly when resentment takes root and no one is watching. In the end, Ray Carruth, once a wife, once a mother, once a woman searching for meaning, became her own undoing. Not because she was angry, but because she was empty. And in that emptiness, she made herself believe that ending a life was the only way to begin her own again. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Was it the quiet ones, the calculated ones, or the ones that felt too familiar? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And stay with us. The stories only grow darker from here. The town of Meridian, Mississippi, was quiet in the summer of 2011. Heat hung heavy in the air, and the only sounds most nights were the low hum of cicadas and the distant bark of dogs. On Maple Street stood a small blue house, ordinary, well-kept, and perfectly average. To the neighbors, it was home to the McLellan family, Caroline and Thomas, married for 15 years, with 2 kids who played in the front yard and bikes leaned against the porch. They looked, from every angle, like a family that had managed to survive life's storms together. But inside, something was unraveling. Caroline McLellan had always been quiet, polite, gracious, the kind of woman who never raised her voice. She ran the household while Thomas worked long shifts as a contractor. But over the years, Thomas had become a different man. He was impatient, volatile, and cruel in small, cutting ways. He controlled her money, her friends, even the time she could call her parents. What began as emotional manipulation deepened into isolation. By the time Caroline realized she was trapped, she had nowhere left to turn. At first, she tried to endure it, convincing herself that every outburst was temporary, that he'd change. But by 2010, Thomas had grown more violent. The shouting matches that began behind closed doors started to spill into public. One night, after a dinner with friends, a neighbor heard glass shattering and a woman sobbing through the walls. Police were called, but no charges were filed. Thomas convinced them it was a marital disagreement. Caroline stood beside him, her hands trembling, and said the same. A few months later, she stopped answering calls from friends entirely. It was around that time that she met Marla, a woman who worked at a local shelter. Caroline had come in one afternoon, not to seek help, but to donate clothing. Marla noticed the bruises, faint, half-healed, and the way Caroline winced when she moved her arm. She asked if she was okay. Caroline smiled and said she'd fallen. But she came back the next week. In the week after, slowly she began to talk. About the shouting, about the fear, about how she sometimes thought of running, but had nowhere to go. In her mind, there were only two ways to end the nightmare: leave or make it stop. By spring, her fear had twisted into desperation. She began writing in a hidden notebook, thoughts, plans, possible escape routes. But somewhere in those pages, her tone shifted. The entries became darker. One, dated April 12th, read simply, "If he dies, I live." A few weeks later, Caroline bought rat poison. She told the clerk she had a problem with raccoons. It wasn't uncommon around Meridian. Most people thought nothing of it. But when investigators later reviewed security footage, they'd see her face, calm, almost serene, as she paid in cash and walked out. In June 2011, Thomas fell violently ill. He vomited, shook with fever, and struggled to breathe. Caroline rushed him to the hospital, crying and clutching his hand. Doctors suspected food poisoning. They treated him, and after 2 days he recovered. But the sickness returned within weeks. Each time the symptoms worsened. By August he was bedridden. Caroline called relatives and spoke of how hard it was watching him suffer, how helpless she felt. No one suspected her. They sent prayers, food, and sympathy. On the night of September 9th, Thomas McLellan took his last breath in his sleep. The autopsy initially listed the cause as acute respiratory failure. No foul play was suspected. The town grieved with Caroline, the loyal wife who had cared for her husband until the end. But secrets have a way of leaking through cracks. 2 months later, Caroline's close friend Marla received an email from her. It wasn't long, just a few sentences, but it chilled her to her core. "I did what I had to do," Caroline wrote. "I don't regret saving myself." Marla didn't respond. She called the police. When investigators reopened the case, they searched Caroline's home. In the back of a kitchen cabinet, behind cleaning supplies, they found the remaining box of poison, the same brand she'd purchased months earlier. Traces of it matched the chemical compounds in Thomas's system. They also found her notebook, the same one filled with diary entries, including the line, "If he dies, I live." During questioning, Caroline broke almost immediately. She didn't cry, didn't yell. She simply spoke. "He wasn't going to let me leave," she said. "He told me if I ever tried, he'd kill me first. So I made sure he couldn't." Her confession divided the town. Some saw her as a murderer. Others saw a victim who'd reached her breaking point. Her trial in 2013 became a national spectacle, a haunting question of morality. Was Caroline McLellan a cold-blooded killer or a woman driven to survival? The prosecution painted her as manipulative, calculating, someone who could have left but chose to kill instead. They showed the poison receipt, the diary entries, and the chilling email to Marla. The defense, on the other hand, detailed years of abuse. They brought witnesses who'd heard Thomas shouting, doctors who'd treated her for bruises, and neighbors who'd seen her flinch when he raised his hand. In the end, the jury couldn't ignore the evidence of abuse, but they also couldn't ignore the deliberate act of murder. Caroline was convicted of voluntary manslaughter and sentenced to 20 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 12. When she spoke at sentencing, she didn't ask for forgiveness. She said only one thing: "I didn't want him to die. I just wanted to live." After the trial, letters poured in, from women who said they understood, from others who'd lived in similar fear. One read, "You did what I couldn't. I just wish it hadn't come to that." Caroline serves her sentence at the Central Mississippi Correctional Facility. She works in the prison kitchen and spends most of her time reading. Guards describe her as quiet, compliant, polite. Some say she still carries a notebook, though now it's filled with poems instead of plans. The McLellan house still stands on Maple Street, its porch swing creaking in the wind. New tenants live there now, a young couple who know little about its history. Sometimes neighbors see a woman, thin and gray-haired, walking past the old place during visiting weekends. She never stops, never looks long, just walks by slowly, as if tracing the outline of a life that once was hers. The case remains one of those that people still debate in true crime circles, not because of its mystery, but because of its moral weight. It forces the question, how far can someone be pushed before the line between victim and criminal blurs? Caroline McLellan's story is not about greed or jealousy. It's about fear. Fear that grew so constant, so heavy, that it became her only companion. In her mind, the choice was never between life and death, but between dying slowly or ending the nightmare. And when the day finally came, she didn't run. She didn't scream. She simply stirred a cup of tea, poured it with steady hands, and decided that freedom, even one earned in prison, was better than living another day afraid. In the heart of suburban Arizona, on a cul-de-sac lined with trimmed lawns and sun-faded mailboxes, stood a tan two-story home that looked like any other. Behind its glass front door, Linda Carlson baked bread on Sundays, sent Christmas cards every year, and hosted backyard barbecues where neighbors laughed beneath the orange sky. To anyone who met her, Linda was the definition of a good wife, attentive, soft-spoken, and devoted to her husband, Dr. Mark Carlson, a respected dentist in their town of Chandler. But good appearances are a fragile thing. By 2013, the Carlsons had been married for 20 years. They had 2 college-aged kids, a comfortable life, and a reputation as a successful couple. Yet beneath the surface, their marriage had been eroding for years. Mark was controlling, not in loud, violent ways, but in quiet ones. Every decision flowed through him, finances, schedules, even Linda's friendships. She wasn't beaten or screamed at. She was erased one decision at a time. Friends noticed small changes. Linda stopped volunteering at church. She avoided gatherings she once loved. She smiled, but only with her mouth, never her eyes. One friend recalled that whenever she mentioned the idea of taking a trip or pursuing a hobby, Linda would laugh nervously and say, "Mark wouldn't like that." When their youngest left for college, the house fell silent, and the silence became unbearable. Mark had started staying out late, claiming business dinners. Linda found receipts for hotel rooms and perfume she didn't own. She confronted him once, but he brushed her off with the kind of cold arrogance that comes from years of control. "Don't start imagining things," he said. "You should be grateful for what you have." That night, Linda sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the half-empty wine glass he'd left behind. For the first time in 20 years, she realized she didn't fear losing him. She feared continuing to live with him. What happened next would turn her from a forgotten housewife into the focus of one of Arizona's most chilling domestic crime cases. In the spring of 2014, Linda started researching sleeping pills online. She searched phrases like lethal dose of Ambien, poisoning without pain, and how to make someone sleep forever. Investigators would later find those searches on her laptop. But at the time, she looked like any other woman going through a quiet depression, lonely, ignored, invisible. By June, Mark had started openly seeing another woman, a hygienist from his office named Rachel. Everyone in town whispered about it, but Linda remained silent. She kept up the facade, dinners, church, small talk, but something had shifted behind her calm expression. On the night of July 18th, the Carlsons hosted a dinner party. Friends described Linda as unusually composed, even cheerful. She served Mark his favorite wine and homemade lasagna. No one noticed the faint bitterness in his glass. After the guests left, the couple sat together in the living room, the glow of the TV flickering across the walls. Mark started coughing, deep, heavy, uncontrollable. Within minutes, he was on the floor. Linda called 911, her voice trembling but steady. "My husband isn't breathing. Please hurry." By the time paramedics arrived, it was too late. Mark Carlson was pronounced dead at the scene. The initial assumption was natural causes. perhaps a heart attack. But when the autopsy report came back, toxicology results revealed an unusually high concentration of zolpidem, the main ingredient in Ambien, mixed with traces of antifreeze. The cause of death, acute poisoning. Investigators quickly turned to Linda. She denied any involvement, insisting she'd only poured him wine that night. But when detectives found a receipt from a hardware store, a bottle of antifreeze purchased 2 weeks earlier, along with her browser history, the puzzle pieces began to fit. Then came the final clue, a series of handwritten notes found in a drawer beside her bed. Short entries, written in looping cursive, dated over several months. He doesn't love me anymore. He deserves to feel what I feel. I can't keep living this way. During interrogation, Linda's composure cracked for the first time. She wept and spoke in bursts, fragments of confession mixed with bitterness. He made me nothing, she said. Every day he reminded me I was lucky he hadn't left me. He told me I'd be nothing without him, and maybe he was right, but I wanted him to stop saying it. Prosecutors argued that Linda planned the murder meticulously, waiting for the perfect night to carry it out. They called it a revenge killing wrapped in domestic familiarity. But the defense painted a different picture. A woman emotionally destroyed, trapped in psychological bondage for decades. A woman who didn't act out of rage, but from years of humiliation and loneliness. Her trial drew national attention. News anchors debated whether she was a manipulative murderer or another victim of coercive control. The invisible abuse that leaves no bruises but destroys everything inside. In court, she listened silently as Mark's colleagues testified about his charm, his success, his generosity. Then came her turn. Her voice was soft, barely audible. He was a good man, she said, but he made me hate myself. And one day I realized I'd rather die than keep feeling that way. I just chose the wrong death. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Linda Carlson was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison. She didn't react to the verdict. She just looked down, her face blank, as if the sentence only confirmed what she already knew, that she'd been living a kind of prison long before the bars. After her conviction, reporters interviewed her daughter, Megan. She was 21, trembling on camera, her voice cracking. I still love my mom, she said, but I can't understand it. She always told me love means forgiveness. I don't know how to forgive this. In prison, Linda adapted quickly to the routines. Early wake-ups, assigned chores, long stretches of silence. She became known among inmates as the listener. Women sought her out for comfort, advice, empathy. She spoke softly, often about guilt, but rarely about Mark. One guard later recalled seeing her during a thunderstorm, standing by the window, murmuring to herself, I just wanted to be seen. The Carlson home was sold 2 years later. The new owners remodeled it completely. New floors, fresh paint, modern furniture. But in the backyard, the lemon tree Linda planted still grows. Neighbors say it blooms every spring, the same season she used to hang lights and host dinners. Every once in a while, someone new moves into the neighborhood, unaware of what happened in that tan house. And every so often, an old neighbor will tell the story quietly, the kind that ends in a long silence. Because there's something especially haunting about crimes that don't come from hatred, but from absence. From the slow suffocation of a person's identity inside a home that looks perfect from the outside. Linda Carlson's story isn't about madness or greed. It's about emptiness, the kind that expands year after year until it finally consumes everything, even love. Behind every headline about a killer wife is a quieter truth, a lifetime of small disappearances, of voices fading behind smiles, of women whose pain went unseen until it broke into something irreversible. And when Linda lifted that wine glass and handed it to her husband, she wasn't just serving a drink. She was offering her last act of defiance in a life where every other choice had already been made for her. In the fall of 2016, the residents of Redmond, Oregon were shaken awake by the kind of crime that doesn't fit its surroundings. It wasn't a big city, not the kind of place where headlines scream of murder. Redmond was quiet. Coffee shops, mountain views, the smell of pine in the air. But one night, inside a neat white house with a red mailbox on Hemlock Drive, Amanda Reese, a mother of 3 and former Sunday school teacher, picked up a gun and changed everything. Amanda and David Reese had been high school sweethearts, the golden couple of their small town. He became a paramedic. She stayed home to raise their kids. To friends and family, they were perfect. Churchgoers, devoted parents, active in the community. But in private, Amanda's world had begun to fracture long before the trigger was ever pulled. By her own account, David's temper had grown sharper over the years. The arguments began small, about bills, the kids, her cooking, but grew into something darker. He wasn't violent, not physically, but his words became knives. He belittled her in front of their children, mocked her dreams, accused her of being lazy for not contributing financially. Over time, she began to shrink, both in presence and spirit. In 2015, she discovered messages on his phone, flirtations with a younger woman from his ambulance unit. When she confronted him, he brushed it off as innocent fun. But something changed after that night. Amanda stopped smiling in photos. She started keeping notes of their arguments, her handwriting tight and trembling. He said, "I'm useless again." He said no one would believe me. 1 year later, on the night of November 12, 2016, Amanda called 911. Her voice was calm but trembling. "There's been an accident. My husband's been shot." When police arrived, David lay dead in the living room, a single gunshot wound to the chest. The gun, his registered firearm, sat on the coffee table. Amanda was covered in tears and shock. "It went off," she kept saying. "It just went off." At first, it looked like a tragic domestic accident. But as detectives began their work, inconsistencies surfaced. The gun had been fired at close range. The bullet's trajectory didn't match her story. And the 911 call, replayed later, revealed a strange calm between the words, almost practiced. When detectives asked her to recount the moments before the shooting, Amanda said they'd been arguing about money again. "He called me worthless," she said softly. "He told me I was nothing." Then, she claimed, he'd grabbed the gun from the drawer. Not to hurt her, but to scare her. "I tried to take it from him. It went off." But forensic tests told another story. The fingerprints on the gun were almost entirely hers. Gunpowder residue was found on her right hand. David's were faint. As evidence mounted, Amanda's version of events began to unravel. Neighbors told police they'd heard shouting, a woman's voice yelling, "I can't take this anymore," followed by silence. During a second interview, Amanda finally broke down. "He wouldn't stop," she whispered. "I wanted him to stop." Prosecutors charged her with second-degree murder, though her defense claimed it was manslaughter, an act born of fear, not malice. During the trial, the courtroom was divided. Half the town saw Amanda as a murderer who snapped after being caught in her own bitterness. The other half saw a woman pushed past breaking, trapped in emotional abuse so deep that violence felt like escape. Prosecutors showed text messages from the days before the shooting. "David, you're pathetic, Mandy. I'm done trying." "Amanda, please stop saying that." "David, you're nothing without me." They painted her as cold, calculating, a woman who'd lost control of her own jealousy. The defense countered with testimony from a psychologist who described her as a victim of coercive control, a form of abuse that strips away autonomy until a person becomes psychologically imprisoned. In one of the trial's most haunting moments, the prosecution played the 911 recording in full. After Amanda's trembling voice reports the shooting, there's a long pause, about 15 seconds of silence before the dispatcher speaks again. During that pause, Amanda whispers to herself almost inaudibly, "It's finally over." That whisper sealed her fate. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury found her guilty of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison. When the verdict was read, Amanda didn't cry. She nodded once, her face pale, and said softly, "I understand." Her children, 2 teenagers and a college freshman, sat in the front row. They refused to look at her as she was led away. Later, her daughter told a reporter, "I loved them both. I just wish she'd left instead." In prison, Amanda took up teaching literacy classes for other inmates. The staff described her as calm, reserved, always polite. One guard said she never raised her voice, never complained, but often sat alone in the yard staring into the distance, as if she was still hearing an argument that wouldn't stop. When interviewed for a documentary 2 years later, Amanda said, "I didn't hate him. I hated who I became with him." Then she added quietly, "And maybe that's the same thing." The Reese home was sold not long after her sentencing. The new owners stripped it of everything, new paint, new furniture, new walls. But sometimes during the quiet Oregon nights, A few neighbors still remember the sound of sirens that broke. The calm that November evening, the moment the perfect couple ended in a single gunshot that echoed across Hemlock Drive. Amanda's story raises the same haunting question echoed throughout so many of these cases. What happens when silence becomes its own kind of violence? When years of emotional suffocation explode in one irreversible moment? It's easy to call her a murderer, and easier still to call her a victim. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the unbearable middle, a space between fear and rage, love and hatred, life and the prison cell she wakes up in every morning. Each night, before lights out, Amanda still writes in a journal. On the inside cover of one of them, found years later during an interview for a true crime series, she'd written one simple line: "He said I'd be nothing without him. Now I am nothing and he's gone." That's how most tragedies like this end, not with monsters, but with two broken people who mistook control for love until there was nothing left to save. In 2018, in a quiet corner of Portsmouth, Virginia, a call came into 911 at 2:17 a.m. The woman's voice was trembling, almost inaudible through tears. "My husband. He's not breathing. Please, please hurry." When paramedics arrived at the modest brick home on Waverly Street, they found Michael Holden, age 41, lifeless in his bed. His wife, Elaine, sat on the floor beside him, her robe soaked in sweat and tears. At first glance, it looked like a sudden medical emergency, a heart attack maybe. There were no signs of struggle, no forced entry, no obvious clues that something terrible had happened. But when the coroner reviewed the case later that morning, he noticed something: the faint scent of almonds on the body. To most people, that would mean nothing. But to anyone familiar with forensics, it was the scent of cyanide. The investigation began before sunrise. Elaine Holden was a nurse's aide at a local hospice, known for her patience and soft-spoken nature. She and Michael had been married for nearly 17 years. To their neighbors, they seemed steady, maybe not passionate, but dependable. They paid their bills, kept up the lawn, and smiled when people passed. But what the neighbors didn't see was the erosion happening quietly inside their marriage. Michael had once been a kind man, but after losing his job in 2014, bitterness began to take root. He started drinking, first on weekends, then most nights. The drinking turned to shouting. The shouting turned to threats. By 2016, Elaine's friends had stopped visiting entirely. He'd humiliate her in front of people. One co-worker later testified. Once at a work dinner, he told her she was too stupid to talk about anything but groceries. Elaine never fought back. She just smiled tightly and stayed quiet. But at home, she wrote in her journal, "He tells me I'm lucky he keeps me. I dream about peace, but peace feels impossible." By 2017, Michael had drained their savings and was demanding Elaine take out credit cards in her name. He controlled every penny she earned. She wasn't allowed to drive without permission. Every part of her life, her phone, her friends, even her family visits, was monitored. So when she learned about cyanide in a casual online article, how quickly it worked, how hard it was to detect, the idea lodged somewhere deep in her mind. Not as a plan, not yet, just a possibility. In December 2017, she ordered a small bottle of potassium cyanide online using her work credentials, claiming it was for rodent control. In her mind, she justified it as a precaution, something she might never use. But the thought of having it nearby brought her a strange sense of safety. A month later, Michael told her he planned to file for divorce, and that she'd leave with nothing. He laughed as he said it. On the night of January 28, 2018, they had dinner together: chicken, potatoes, and a glass of wine. Elaine later told police it had been one of their better evenings. He'd even kissed her cheek before bed. But when he went upstairs, she stayed behind at the table for almost an hour, staring at the wine bottle. What happened next was quiet, deliberate, and irreversible. She mixed a small amount of cyanide into his glass, carried it upstairs, and set it on his nightstand. He thanked her for being sweet, and within 20 minutes, he was gone. When police questioned her, she told the same story she'd told 911, that he'd simply stopped breathing in his sleep. But toxicology reports revealed the truth within days. The cyanide concentration in his blood was unmistakable. Detectives found the bottle hidden inside a hollow shampoo container in the bathroom. When they confronted her, she didn't deny it. She simply whispered, "I didn't think anyone would miss him." Her confession was flat, almost emotionless. the tone of someone who'd rehearsed the moment 1,000 times in her head. During her trial, the courtroom filled with reporters fascinated by the paradox. A gentle hospice worker who'd taken a life so calmly. The prosecution painted her as methodical and heartless. She didn't snap, the district attorney said. She planned this. She wanted control, and when she couldn't have it, she took his. But the defense told another story. They described years of psychological torment, isolation, and control. They read from her journals aloud. He said if I left, I'd be dead. I believed him. The jury sat in silence as they heard the words. One witness, a former co-worker, testified that Elaine once came to work with bruises she tried to hide under makeup. She told me she fell, the woman said, but her hands were shaking the whole time. Still, the act of poisoning, slow, planned, deliberate, left little room for mercy. In the end, Elaine was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 32 years in prison. When asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, she looked up at the judge, her voice thin but steady. I know I took a life, she said. I just wish someone had helped me before I became someone capable of doing it. Her children, now adults, never visited her after that day. Her daughter wrote in a statement, she wanted peace. She gave herself prison instead. At the Women's Correctional Center in Goochland, Elaine lives quietly. She works in the infirmary, the same kind of environment she once thrived in outside. Guards describe her as calm, obedient, polite. She never talks about her crime. But sometimes she hums to herself while she works. Low, tuneless melodies that sound almost like lullabies. A journalist who interviewed her for a true crime documentary asked, "Do you regret it?" Elaine paused. "Every day," she said. "But I regret surviving him even more." The house on Waverly Street has been remodeled. The new owners didn't know its history until after they moved in. The realtor never mentioned the death. But sometimes they say they can still smell something faint. Not rot, not decay, but something chemical, sharp like almonds when the air turns cold. Neighbors still remember the night of flashing lights, the quiet ambulance that drove away without sirens. And they remember Elaine's face, pale, trembling, but almost peaceful, as if she'd finally finished something she'd been trying to end for years. Her case remains one of the most unsettling in Virginia's domestic crime history, not because of its violence, but because of its stillness. There was no fight, no chaos, no moment of madness. Just a woman sitting at a table, staring into a glass, and deciding she'd been quiet long enough. Sometimes the deadliest crimes aren't loud. They happen softly in the same tone as an apology. And when Elaine poured that wine, she wasn't thinking of revenge. She was thinking of silence, the kind that can't be broken by shouting, the kind that finally, at last, felt like peace. In 2005, in a small Kansas town surrounded by fields and long, quiet roads, Caroline Mercer was known for her roses. Her front yard bloomed every spring in perfect reds and soft whites. The garden was her pride, her sanctuary, her escape from a life that looked peaceful but wasn't. Caroline had been married to Pastor Thomas Mercer for 23 years. He was respected, even feared, by some, a preacher who commanded every room he entered. To the congregation, he was a man of God. To Caroline, he was a man who made her kneel to pray after he'd made her cry. They met when she was 19, barely out of high school, and he was already the rising voice of the local church. He told her she was chosen, that God had sent her to be his partner in ministry. For years she believed it. She believed everything he said. But behind closed doors, he ruled through humiliation. He'd stand her in front of a mirror and list her sins. Too prideful, too lazy, too worldly. When she tried to speak, he'd say, "The Lord doesn't need your opinion, Caroline. He needs your obedience." Their son Caleb left home at 17 after a fight that ended with Thomas slapping him across the face during dinner. Caroline didn't stop him from leaving. She couldn't. She just watched from the porch as her boy disappeared down the gravel road, duffel bag slung over his shoulder. After that, the house got quieter. Thomas became more controlling, more erratic. He'd forbid her from visiting neighbors. He monitored her phone calls. Once, when she forgot to iron his shirts before Sunday service, he made her stand in the cold yard while he preached about wives who fail their purpose. The congregation clapped when he spoke. They didn't know who he was talking about. By 2004, Caroline had stopped attending church entirely. She claimed health problems. Thomas didn't argue. He preferred her absence. The church began to see him as a man burdened with a wayward wife. Sympathy flowed his way. Then one morning, everything changed. A fire started in the Mercer home just after midnight on January 14th, 2005. When firefighters arrived, they found the living room engulfed in flames. The roof had already begun to collapse. Neighbors had called 911 after hearing what they thought was an explosion. Inside, they found Pastor Mercer unconscious near the doorway. His wife was outside, barefoot, covered in soot, screaming his name. He survived, barely. Second-degree burns covered his arms and back. The fire marshal later confirmed the blaze had started in the basement, near the old furnace. But something didn't make sense. The fire spread too quickly, and the accelerant traces didn't match anything used for heating. An arson investigation followed. At first, Caroline played the role of the devastated wife perfectly. Trembling hands, red eyes, quiet voice. But when investigators found traces of gasoline on her robe and shoes, her story began to unravel. She claimed she had gone downstairs to find Thomas after smelling smoke. She said the fumes must have soaked into her clothes. But detectives found more. A half-empty gas can hidden behind the shed, her fingerprints all over it. When confronted, she denied everything. For 3 weeks, she maintained her innocence. Then one morning, she asked to speak privately to the lead investigator. What she said shocked him. "I didn't mean to kill him," she began. "I meant to scare him. I wanted him to feel a little of the fear he gave me every day." She said the plan had started small, just an idea she couldn't stop thinking about. She'd wanted to light a small fire in the basement while he slept upstairs, force him to run, force him to see that he wasn't invincible. But when the flames caught the wooden beams, they spread faster than she expected. "I thought I'd put it out," she whispered. "I panicked. And then it was too late." The confession was partial, but enough. At trial, the prosecution called it attempted murder by arson. They argued she'd soaked the basement deliberately, intending to kill him. They presented the gas can, the financial records, a new life insurance policy signed just 2 months earlier. Caroline said she didn't even know about the policy, that Thomas handled all their finances. But the damage was done. The jury saw calculation, not desperation. The most damning testimony came from her own son, Caleb, who returned to testify after years of silence. He didn't defend his mother. He told the truth as he saw it. He was cruel, Caleb said. He broke her. But she broke too. "I don't think she lit that fire because she hated him. I think she lit it because she couldn't see another way to exist." After 2 days of deliberation, the jury found her guilty of first-degree arson and attempted second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 28 years in prison. Pastor Mercer survived but never returned to the pulpit. His burns never healed properly, and he moved to another county. He told reporters that he forgave his wife, as a man of God must. But those who knew him said he never truly did. He simply erased her from every sermon, every memory, every mention. Caroline was sent to the Topeka Correctional Facility, where she became known among inmates for her quiet discipline. She joined a horticulture program, tending to flowers and small garden plots in the prison yard. Roses again, always roses. When a journalist visited her 10 years into her sentence, she said something that stayed with him. "People think prison started when I came here. It didn't. It started the day I married him." Her son, Caleb, now living in Missouri, wrote her occasionally but never visited. In one letter, he told her he'd started a family. She never replied, but she kept the letter folded neatly in her Bible, between Psalms and Lamentations. The guards say she never complains. When asked about her past, she only says, "God gave me silence, and I learned to live in it." On her 15th year inside, one of the younger inmates asked her if she regretted it. Caroline thought for a long time, then said softly, "I regret that I didn't burn the fear first." Her story circulates quietly among true crime enthusiasts, a case that still divides opinions. Was she a monster or a survivor? The burned house was torn down years ago. In its place now stands a small church parking lot. On quiet nights, locals say they sometimes see a woman sitting near the edge of the lot, where the roses used to grow, her hands folded in her lap, head bowed, not in prayer, but in something heavier. Regret, perhaps, or maybe peace disguised as it. In the end, these women weren't born killers. They were made in silence, shaped by fear, and driven by a love that turned into its own prison. These were the wives who went from marriage to prison, women whose vows became verdicts, and whose love stories ended behind bars. For more real-life cases where truth is stranger than fiction, subscribe now and join us in the next deep dive into the shadows of real crime.